Welcome to a special edition of the Land Matters podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. We're here at the President's House at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we're here to do something a little bit different for the Land Matters podcast, talking with three people who have been pillars at the Lincoln Institute for many years, who retired this summer. We feel like it's an opportunity that we need to seize on before they all move on to other exploits for posterity, but also to learn about what it takes to have impact at a nonprofit research organization dedicated to better land policy. The three individuals are Armando Carbonell, who ran programs in urban planning and land conservation, Daphne Kenyon, an economist who was part of the tax program at the Lincoln Institute, and Martim Smolka, another economist who ran the Latin America program. So three different people in three different areas of inquiry, although, as I think we're about to find out, all interconnected. We're going to begin by asking each of them to recall how they started out at the Lincoln Institute way back when, and then pivot to their experiences mixing academic research and real-time applications of the work in the U.S. and all around the world. I think we'll find this will be a bit of a revelation of what it takes to develop research programs and provide training for practitioners and to present solid information for policymakers and political leaders, and to have an impact as a nonprofit organization to make the world a better place. I should say, for the record, the mission of the Lincoln Institute is to improve quality of life through the effective use, taxation, and stewardship of land. We're a private operating foundation dating back to 1946 and the establishment of the Lincoln Foundation by our founder, John C. Lincoln. Today, we're all about creative approaches to land as a solution to economic, social, and environmental challenges. Through education, training, publications, and events, we integrate theory and practice to inform public policy decisions worldwide. So we've got a lot to live up to here, but let's all take a deep breath and relax and begin to tell this story of how the three of you worked your magic over the years. As I mentioned, I'd like to start out by asking each of you to briefly recall how you first became aware of the Lincoln Institute, what year that was, and what you found here, and how you were drawn to this organization such that you spent much of your careers here. So Daphne, may we start with you?
In the spring of 1988, I was in Washington, D.C. at the Urban Institute, decided to get married, and needed a job in Boston. My boss at that time, Bob Ebel, knew Ben Chinitz at the Lincoln Institute and wangled a visiting position for me. So my first time at the Lincoln Institute was from August of 1988 to the end of July 1989. Then I became a professor at Simmons College, had some contact with the Lincoln Institute, spoke at an event, did one course, and then at that point, the Lincoln Institute was very different. 21 people. That's it. Then in October of 2004, Joan Youngman called me about possibly doing a policy-focused report. And she described what they were. And I thought, And we had a conversation. And then in August of 2005, that's when I started. First part-time, then eventually full-time, and just retired the end of June 2022. What kept me at Lincoln was policy-focused reports, really, and producing things and communicating to policymakers. And I always felt that the policy-focused reports were high quality. So for me, quality was the key.
And what was that first report?
Oh, that was the property tax school funding dilemma, which is now going to have a total remake, and it's coming out very soon, and it's done with my co-authors, Bethany, Paquin, and Andy Reschovsky. Joan Youngman had the idea that schools and property taxes are very connected because so much of the funding for K through 12 education in the United States comes from the property tax, and so much of the property tax goes to schools. And she thought that there should be something that explains this to the general public and policymakers. So it took me about 2 years, but it had a long shelf life, and now it's coming out again.
All right, Armando, how about you? Can you go down memory lane when you first got engaged with the Lincoln Institute?
Sure. And I started working here full time in the spring of 1999, but I had been associated with the Institute for many years, teaching in some of the training programs. I was a member of something called the Study Group on Land Conservation in New England for a number of years before coming up to Cambridge from Cape Cod in '99. And so I was very familiar with the Institute and its programs. I'd actually had some training programs commissioned for folks on Cape Cod by the Institute. So I had been both a faculty member and a client of the Institute back when we were set up as a school and had an education department and so forth. And that was a regular thing. But I was hired to start something called the Program on Land as Common Property, and that was an interesting challenge. It was brought to my attention that might have certain socialistic implications, but I did point out that Henry George used the phrase "land as common property" many times in his seminal work, Progress and Poverty, which was key to the founding of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. So I felt that I was really coming in at a point that really connected the origins of the Institute with my interests in land planning and the connections between environment and the need for development, for housing, and for places for people to work. Places for people to grow food. And it was kind of an all-around land use interest that brought me to the Institute with that very interesting frame of land as common property.
Now, you had been head of the Cape Cod Commission. Can you just tell us briefly about that? Because that was essentially a regional planning entity, what was it not?
It was. I was the executive
And remains.
director of the Cape Cod Commission. It was actually was involved in setting it up. It was a new institution on Cape Cod, a new planning system. It was both a planning agency and a regulatory agency, so it had a permitting function and really was in a position to shape land use in an authoritative way on Cape Cod, and got into all of the issues that I mentioned a minute ago, from affordable housing to economic development strategies to dealing with coastal resource issues. Back in the 90s, we didn't talk as much about climate change, but that certainly became an interest at the Institute and continues to be on Cape Cod. So it was a good place to come from. I was running a pretty comprehensive planning agency. I felt I had a sense of what planners needed to do their jobs better, and that I could use the resources of the Institute to bring that to them. And ultimately, and soon after getting to Cambridge, we were able to create programs like the Big City Planning Directors Institute, which gave us direct contact with practitioners at the top of the field to have a sense of what we could do to help them the most. What information did they need? What research should we commission? What can we learn from them, and what can they learn from each other? And that kind of set the pattern for a number of programs following that.
And finally, Martim Smolka, how did you start out?
Actually, I got into the Institute through Cuba to give a course for Cubans on urban economics. So this was 94, the end of 94. So I went there, and after that course, they asked me, the research the director asked me to to start a research on Latin America on the state of the arts of urban, the functional overland markets. And after, when I was already starting that research, I got a call from a headhunter that was looking for a replacement for David Barkin. At the time, the director would stay only for 2 years, and so I was about to go to Cornell actually to spend a postdoctoral there or something like that. And so I said, well, what the heck, let's see. And I came here to spend perhaps 1 year or perhaps 2 years at most, and I'm here for 27 years. And this has to do with at the time I was pretty much interested in the understanding of land markets, and particularly the entrance actually was through a seminar in Cambridge University that Peter Ward organized. Actually, that seminar generated a book that the Institute published. It's called The Methodology of Land and Housing Market Analysis, and that book was published in 94. But the seminar was in 91. This is how the whole story started. In the meantime, I went to other countries, to Mexico also, to spread the word on how to do this kind of research.
Well, I want to pick up on that. The Lincoln Institute had been international in scope in Taiwan and some other places, but the getting into Latin America was a big step, and it's a vast region with all kinds of challenges, from slums to the provision of infrastructure, just a whole slew of issues from Mexico to Argentina. How did you even get started approaching developing a program in Latin America?
That's an interesting question, because as most Brazilian scholars, we were looking more to the U.S. and Europe, and we had our backs to Spanish Latin America. We didn't know much about that. At the time, I knew something. I'd been to Argentina, I'd been to Mexico, and I'd been to Ecuador. And that was in Cuba in '94. That was basically it. And say, how do we start to do that? So the strategy that we devised there was for what is a 3-stage process. First, we tried to map on the publications in Latin America who are the people who actually have written anything about urban land markets or anything close to that. And urban land market wasn't that much of a hot topic in the region, as you would imagine. So then we mapped the names, and we start crossing their names to see who referred to whom and who are the pivots there, or the cross. And then we interviewed them. And we went to many of these countries and interviewed the people that we saw the 2 or 3 names, and we've ended up with a so-called dirty dozens that became the basis for all the programs that we organized in the region, and they played a key role, because this is having someone that would be the ears and the eyes and the mouth for the Institute to a large extent. And so we rely heavily on them. We organize a number of workshops with the whole group so that we created some cohesiveness there. So the people became very much, they like to be with each other, and that was an important part of that. So the strategy was mostly to find out with whom we can rely on different countries and help us understand what is to be done there.
So it was developing a network.
Yes, absolutely.
Of people on the ground. And Daphne, did you find yourself in similar circumstances? A vast subject, the property tax, municipal finance, urban economics. But I think also similarly, part of the answer, at least, was convening or nurturing a kind of a network of practitioners and policymakers and academics, and bringing them all together. Is
in terms of having impact, I think of it as a 2-pronged thing, just from my vantage point. I view policy-focused reports and policy briefs as a mechanism to have impact. And the first policy-focused report I wrote was used by National Conference of State Legislatures to give to legislative staff, to legislators for years and years. It was featured in the top state local public finance text, and various professors used it in their syllabus. So the policy focus report is a great vehicle. But you're right. We also had convenings at Lincoln House, and Lincoln House was a lovely spot, particularly in the spring. And we happened to be lucky enough to be in New England, where you have legislatures from all New England states who can actually get to Boston. And we had an alliance with the Boston Fed, their public policy shop. And so we would invite legislators and try to fit as many people as possible and try to have communication among them, then bring academics in who could speak in plain English. And we had a situation where, yes, the legislators would learn from the academics or other policy people, and then the academics would find out, oh, what I'm working on may not be that interesting, but maybe I should work on that. So you had kind of a nice circle.
This was the New England, what was it called?
It was called Economic Perspectives
That's
on
right.
State and Local Taxes. And it ran from 2008 to 2019. And right now, I think Jenna Martin is thinking, well, what should we do now that we're partly in the virtual age and so many organizations are facing this? What should we do in person? What should we do virtually? How should we work hybrid? So it's it's a turning point, not just for us, but for every nonprofit that's trying to reach out.
But the original, or part of the original idea was that you didn't want anything to just sit on a shelf.
Right.
You wanted people to be able to use it.
Yeah, and we wanted people to talk to each other. And over lunch, I remember some legislators were talking to an analyst, and they said, well, maybe we should work on a tax expenditure budget for our state. And so it was neat how things came up. And the legislatures work different from state to state. And so there were a lot of aha moments when a legislator from New Hampshire being paid $100 a year would talk to a legislator from Massachusetts, where it's much more professional, where they have staff, and it's like a different world. But we were just extraordinarily lucky that they could all drive to Cambridge.
Yes, getting together, sharing stories. Armando, does this sound familiar? I'm thinking of the network of city planners or urban planners. Tell us a little bit about how that unfolded and how you approached
very familiar. And listening to Martim and Daphne brings to mind the evolution of the organization and how, at least in my experience, we went from open enrollment courses, or essentially people self-selected to come to us for training, and I did a number of those, to a more intentional approach to reach out to people who we thought would be in a position to have greater impact and develop specialized networks and even what at one time we called clubs of people in similar positions, like big city planning directors, who would have a lot in common and be able to contribute their own experience to our programs, as well as to hear from experts and benefit from research that we were able to provide. So for me, at least, that was a transition from the school model to the private operating foundation, where impact and changing the world became a much more important priority. And I welcomed that change. I thought that simply giving a course and seeing who shows up could often lead to disappointment. And it really makes a lot of sense, given the size of our organization, to be selective and to be very intentional about who we present to, who our audience needs to be in order to have that impact in the world.
And you found a very hungry audience, didn't you? To this day, this group of city planners gets together every year.
That's the longest standing program that I've been involved in, and it's still very vibrant and throws off a lot of energy. It's interesting how providing an opportunity for people who don't usually get to see each other very often, who have a lot in common, have similar challenges and pressures, bring them to Cambridge, and from the beginning, it's a program that was produced jointly with the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. Bring them to Harvard, bring them to the Lincoln House, have them tell us what's going on in their cities. It's always the most popular feature of the program every year is a roundtable, kind of get the picture across the country of what the issues are, what the challenges are that these directors are dealing with, get them away from their mayors and in a safe place where they can tell the truth about what's going on, what the real problems are that they're facing, get them to talk not just about their success stories, about the most vexing problems that they face, and share whatever help they can give each other, important part of the work, but also listen to them. And I think probably the most significant thing in terms of our taking something from that group has to do with the Institute's involvement in climate change. And it happens that one of the directors from Portland, Oregon, Gil Kelly, was very far along in terms of his city's approach to climate change, and brought that to the group. And the group got excited about it and said, our mayors are all starting to come to us to ask us to put strategies together, and we don't know anything about climate, and help us. And that led to policy focus reports and other research activities in support of city planning and climate change. And might not have happened without that group bringing it to us.
Talking about, if I could, talking about indoors or endogenous cross-fertilization, we actually borrowed the ideas of city planners and directors, and we did our own version of that in Latin America, in Brazil, in Latin America, and that was also, again, very productive, and this was something that we learned a lot, not only now the directors, but the idea of how to do these things that we imported from this group.
So, I'll having had a swallow of coffee, I'll tell my story because it relates to Martim and the big city planning directors, because we invited Martim to speak to them about land value capture, a concept that I'm sure he'll say more about in the course of this conversation. But a central idea in the work of the Lincoln Institute, going back to the origins with Henry George. And he gave a very compelling talk. The planning director from Denver, Colorado, had been dealing with rezoning issues, got the idea that before one rezones, one really needs to put in place a system of value capture so that the benefits that accrue, the incremental increase in land values that accrue from government action, in this case upzoning, can actually be captured and used for public good, for example, providing infrastructure that is needed to support development. Got on the phone with the city council president on his way back to Denver and said, sort of, hold the presses. We've got a new way of thinking about this. And this story's been told before, but it's a true story. Without that group coming to Cambridge and without Martim cross-fertilizing through his experiences in Latin America, Denver would not have had the experience it's had with land value capture, which is one of the more notable stories in the U.S.
All right, so let's go to this next segment, because we're all trying to learn from you and your experiences here. Let me pose the following possibly more challenging question, and that is to tell us about the times when you may have thought that things were running on fumes, or that a particular program or initiative might not work out, but you stuck with it, and the value of that. And then also, to balance that out, those times when you did pull back and move on. Armando, let's continue with you.
Thanks, Anthony. I think one of the longest running and possibly most successful programs of the Institute had to do with land conservation and the origins of the Land Trust Alliance. I mentioned I had been a member of the study group on land conservation in New England before coming up to work full-time at the Institute. And members of that group included Kingsbury Brown, who was the key player in creating the Land Trust Alliance. So Kingsbury Brown, a Boston lawyer specialized in conservation issues, was his passion. Took a year off, came to the Institute, put on a number of programs, but basically traveled the country and talked to the folks involved in private land conservation, and tried to find out what it would take to bring them to a higher level in terms of their performance and protect more land and be better stewards of the land that they had in charge. And he got the idea by talking to people that there really should be a formal network, the Land Trust Alliance, to bring people together, do training, bring up the level of professionalism of what was mostly a volunteer activity at the time, and was successful in organizing that new organization, getting it off the ground. The Institute stayed with that, and as I say, continued to have programs. The one in New England that I participated in several years later, after the founding of the Land Trust Alliance. Many cooperative programs over the years. We've done research and participated in research, national surveys of protected land and other related inquiry with the Land Trust Alliance. But I'd say perhaps the most significant outcome of our long-standing relationship was the idea to take something like the Land Trust Alliance and bring that to an international audience. And this is where the International Land Conservation Network came from, one of our more recent ventures, but very well established now throughout the world, and taking what we learned in the creation of the Land Trust Alliance, bringing it to other countries, in a very different way, in a way that makes sense in other legal systems and other cultures, but in a way that has really taken off and is, as I say, one of our most successful programs. Land Trust Alliance obviously continues to participate in the International Land Conservation Network.
Yeah, I just have to say, I mean, look at the Land Trust Alliance right now as an organization, big organization, millions and millions of acres in conservation. So started with humble beginnings, one man and a few people, and then look what it grew into.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also a story about the Institute getting something started and then sending it out into the world and letting it go. Mm-hmm. And I think that's often something that we think about with a new program. Is this something that we're going to keep in-house? Is this something that we're going to put on its own feet? And indeed, with the International Land Conservation Network, we decided to sort of keep it closer in-house. And it is not, a fully independent organization. It really is a program of the Institute. And that's because, in this case, it makes more sense for us to continue to nurture it and to work with it. So we have not, in effect, launched it on its own, but kept it as a program. So I'll give you an example of something that we didn't stay with. And having mentioned that creating networks and clubs of folks in similar jobs, like planning directors, is something that we've done. We had the idea that there could be a club of state planning directors. And for a number of years, we convened state planning directors from around the country. And after many attempts, we decided to abandon that. One of the issues that we hadn't realized going in was that not every state actually had a state planning director. Not every state really was interested in state planning. Turned out actually relatively few were. And we started inviting in people who weren't really state planning directors. We had a county planner from Nevada. We had a fish and game guy from Wyoming. It was getting a little bit stretched as a concept, and at some point we said, well, wait a minute, maybe this is, this whole idea is off, that there isn't enough coherence in state planning as a field to actually convene state planning directors, and so we walked away.
Well, this is part of it too, right? You were recognizing when to pull back and when to be nimble. Daphne, when did you stick with it, and when did you make some tweaks?
In terms of stick-to-itiveness, I'd say it's the Lincoln Institute Scholars Program, which we started in 2010. So this is a mentoring program to get people with PhDs in economics a few years ago, to get them together with journal editors to help them learn how to publish in economics. And at the time we did this, we thought, no one else is doing this. And if we can get relatively junior scholars interested in our topics, then they will be working on them for their entire professional life. What great leverage. So we did it in 2010. It was successful. 2011, I still remember sitting on my living room floor and thinking, we just don't have that many applications. What are we going to do? And so at the time, we just, did what you'd expect, which is postpone the deadline. The deadline was one time, and we postponed it. And then we worked on getting more of a mailing list and so forth. And, we rescued the program. We got good applicants. And fast forward to 2019, we had quadrupled the number of applicants. And in that year, we had more of a problem of, different places are copying us. Georgia State has a program like this. An urban economics conference, they're doing mentoring. National Tax Association is having it. So, in the long run, very successful. But when I was sitting there on the floor going, what am I going to do? There aren't enough applications. If I just pulled the plug then, it would have been a mistake. So in terms of, I don't have a program that was stopped, but I have a policy focus report that made two really important adjustments. So this is the one, payments in lieu of taxes, balancing municipal and nonprofit interests. And payments in lieu of taxes are pilots, are voluntary contributions made by nonprofits to help pay for city services. So Greg Ingram, who was heading Lincoln, called me into his office, and he had a working paper that was entitled, Robbing Peter to Pay Paul, something like, is a pilot program good for you? And he said, well, this is a good topic, but this paper is just wrong. It's because it was all about how local governments could tap nonprofits and get money from them. And so he said, would you and Adam Langley be interested in writing a policy focus report about it? So we said, well, we'll have to start from the beginning, but yeah, this looks interesting. And, we worked on it, we had a draft, and then our second major turn, was when we had a thinker session. So a thinker session is something that I was familiar with from the first think tank I worked at. And you get people from different views in, and they look at the draft, and hopefully they don't trash it, but they give you constructive criticism. So we had a thinker session, nonprofits like Harvard and, local government officials. And at the end, Adam and I realized, oh, well, I can see that we're way too on the municipal side, We really, didn't give nonprofits enough, benefit, enough credence. And that's part of how we ended up with this title, balancing municipal and nonprofit interests. We made a big adjustment. So, I'm just much in favor of this construct that we've used at Lincoln, a before action review and an after action review. And we weren't doing it at that time, but I just think so often it makes sense to, to stand back and take a fresh look. And then sometimes, you realize, hey, make time for a right turn here or a left turn, or maybe turn around and go backwards. But those were some times that really stand out in my memory.
And just to emphasize, colleges and universities and nonprofit organizations, they're exempt from paying property taxes.
Yes, thanks for clarifying.
And so if there's some sort of system for making these voluntary contributions, that's, politically and otherwise, that's a delicate matter. Because they don't have to, right?
Exactly. And if you go too far, then they say, are you going to take away this right we've had since the very beginning of the country? And so that is an utter bombshell. So you don't want to get into bombshell territory.
Right. Or see you in court territory, right?
Yes.
And finally, Martim, I think of all people, your career has been one of experimentation, and it's been very pragmatic, bringing together these academics and others as you went along, but also intervening where issues kind of flared up in the region of Latin America. So when did you find that you were glad that you really stuck with it, and then when did you pull back?
Well, I have a long story of frustrations and some surprising positive successes also. But let me go to some of these frustrations because I think there are three groups of stakeholders or influencers, I would say, that the Institute needs to address, and it has always been really difficult. And there are congresspeople, legislators in general. They are the ones who would be good if the Institute could actually contact and reach out. These are three very critical groups that we depend a lot if we want to make land policy effective, and that we have a long list of frustrations here. I think journalists are the one that we are moving in a better path now on doing some programs and trying to identify how to actually attract them and how to make them interested in what we do and the things that we, and the way we communicate and the way we transfer knowledge, if you may. But we had a long history of trying to deal with legislators. We have some cases of doing programs strictly to them, but organize this as systematic as organize them as a club or something like that, it's almost impossible, I would say. That has been a huge and judges, that's another one. We had some major frustrations with judges also. This is a hard group to reach out. But we did have some positive surprises, and one of them has to do with the Institute becoming a school at some point, and then when we started to organize, we at the time, at almost at the same time, we realized that we need to build capacity in Latin America. So we needed to actually get the right people who are decision makers actually get the information that we think they should get, and we also understood at the time that they had a lot to learn from each other. So we started to organize professional development courses. This is a full week course that we, at the time when we started, we paid for people that we selected from Latin America and brought everybody here to Cambridge. And we had a full week here of immersion here of a very intense courses, and that worked pretty well up to September 11th. And then we had an issue of people getting their visas, and that became quite complicated. So we started to run these programs in Latin America themselves. After COVID, also we started to run these things on a remote. Say, they're still going to be interested even if they're staying in their own home. Yes, they are. And then we still get the 300 and so-called a typical 250 to 300 something applicants for the 35, 40 slots that we have in these typical courses. They are still very, very attractive to them, and they're still our flagship programs. And so this has been a long way on the and these we found out that these programs are the kind of information that we get from them in these programs, and the way we can rejuvenate our agenda through that discussion is really very positive, and this is probably one of the most positive things we've done.
Well, let's do a bit of a lightning round on this subject, and that's communicating about your work, making the work accessible to journalists, scholars, planning board members, cabinet ministers, mayors. Have you learned any secret formula or principles about communicating about your work? And Daphne, let's start with you.
Well, I have a commitment to communicating to broad audiences that might come from teaching introductory economics for years and years. And so 2 places where that was applied in the property tax was first with respect to significant features of the property tax, which is an excellent property tax database that we have about the United States, which describes the property tax in great detail in all 50 states. And I started, and partly based on your experience, Anthony, and trying to walk journalists through it, I started thinking, oh, this database is sort of like a PhD database, but we need something that speaks more broadly. So I talked Joan Youngman into State-by-State Property Tax at a Glance, which is a website with narratives and a visualization tool that in 5 pages describes the property tax in each state. And it varies so much. And that was, I think it's great. I wish it was used more. But then also along the same lines, when Dakin came, then, we had an expert videographer. And so we have 2 fabulous videos about the property tax, the mechanics, and then why the property tax. So, I love taking the same topic and doing it at different levels, and it's almost like translating to a different language, because you can say something in one group that you can't say in the other, and you always constantly have to think, okay, I want to put myself in that person's shoes. What do these words mean to that person? And, I think getting out our message is so important, so we should say, yeah, if we need to say it 5 times, yes, with 5 different vehicles, that helps.
Armando, communicating has always been, it seems to me, very important to you. Have you learned about any, particular principles or strategies? I mean, we're talking about urban planning, or one part of your work, urban planning. So stop and think about that. Like, how do you make that come alive?
Right. Well, early on in my time at the Institute, we had the opportunity, it was really brought to us by Katie Lincoln, the board chair, to do a series of documentary films on American cities, actually metropolitan regions, called Making Sense of Place. And that was a major undertaking. These were high production value, public television ready hour-long documentaries, starting in Phoenix, going to Cleveland, then on to Portland, Oregon, and learned a lot about telling stories about cities that help people to understand our land policy interests in those places. It was fairly challenging, actually, and working with a good production team and good local sources and local advisors in those places, all of which we had good contacts with. Learned a lot, and I think one measure of success is that lots of people watch those videos on public television. We were convinced that they had enough long-term value to actually go back and do a kind of update recently of some new stories in the places to show how things had moved from, I don't know, 15 years before or so when we first made these. But it was a good experience, and I think it further got us into the world of communicating through video and through other visual means. Another story probably worth telling has to do with visualizing density, which is one of our projects that I kind of brought to the Institute early on. I really felt that planners and citizens did not understand density. As a result, good projects, in particular affordable housing, was very hard to get approved because people reacted to a misconception of what density really means, and that if we could provide tools that help people to understand how density actually works, we would help people make better decisions. And this is a project that was based in part on aerial photography of real places, in part on analysis of these land use patterns, and again, different means of communicating that. We had a CD-ROM, which people could take to a zoning hearing and actually play the images and use them to help to teach people about density. And anecdotally, we understand that actually helped people make decisions that otherwise would not have been made. And a website. All of this is on my mind because I know we're looking back to revive the visualizing density
Right, this is going to be
material
updated
on
as
the
well.
web.
Yeah.
So a little advertisement for coming attraction, but I trust that will be available in the not too distant future. But again, we were trying to reach people, as Daphne says, and take what are sometimes abstract and difficult ideas and make them more concrete and more understandable. We even commissioned a series of games for people in the Sim City kind of style to actually play with density, and also a range of interactive quizzes and other ways to engage people around what I think is still a difficult subject.
Yeah, reaching people a little bit where they are as well. And Martim, finally, communicating about your work.
Oh, this is the main issue that the Institute, the main challenge the Institute of having this agenda on land policy, on understanding the relevance of land policy and communicating and making or having people understand its importance. So how do we do that has been a major issue that had been following us on all these years, and how to do that. And this is because, as you know, as Armando was even saying, it's policymakers in general, they know nothing about land markets. So, well, we need a lot of cases. That's something that every time that we talk with policymakers and about a new idea or something, the way to give me the case. Where this has been done, how it was done, but also having something that is appealing for them. And for instance, I think the Institute, and now I'm talking a little bit about Latin America, and specifically in the sense that I think we have been very fortunate in giving planners in the region an agenda that they didn't have. In the sense, for instance, that there are a number of people that are very much social responsible. They're concerned about the number of inequities and issues there, and they like how to provide social housing and things like that. But how do you do it? How do you fund that? This is an open question, and we have been, in one way or the other, passing on an idea. Well, there is something. It's not a silver bullet, but something that could help you and put things together. That there is, when the land markets generate values, some of these values can be siphoned back again to fund some of these things that we care about. So that understanding is appealing. People, and this is public officials in general, they pay attention to that because, You're leaving money on the table, and then that is something that they understand when you raise this issue. So this is another way of getting a good topic with a good message for them. That's, oh, this is new. This is one way of looking at things that we never thought about. This is one way of motivating them to get into this discussion. And the other third one is something that Armando himself also mentioned there. It's gaming. Gaming has become, using games to teach, it's relevant. It helps a lot. The main challenge we have is, how do you teach architects or lawyers the fundamentals of land markets without an equation, without a graph, without a table? How do you do that? And so games help a lot. And this is, and we had recently, last July, I was in Brazil, invited by a municipality there, and with a big program, and they wanted to. This was a discussion on their new master plan, where there was a number of issues on value capture. In that group, there was about 170 people there, and it was a big group of developers there. And we have them playing that game, and the developers were enchanted with that. So this is finally, I understand. This is exactly how we do it. And it was nice to hear that. How relevant this thing communicate with people who normally don't have much academic knowledge about these issues.
Sometimes it takes a game. Sometimes it takes a cartoon.
Yes,
right?
The cartoon,
and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we've been talking about your approach to your work, but really underneath it all, we've been talking about some really big issues. So I want to finish big and consider the substance and the subject matter at hand: informal settlement, financing infrastructure, municipal finance, climate change, now looming over everything. So I'd like to ask each of you what you see is the major challenge going forward in each of your areas. I want you to talk about the most daunting, intractable challenges that require a new approach or perhaps some innovation to move forward. And so point us in the right direction. Martim, let's start with you.
I think one of the major challenges we have is if we could simply have developers understanding that, for instance, value capture is not something that it's a problem for them, it's a solution for them, that they could benefit a lot. And some of them actually have been realizing that with the money collected, they're used to promote social housing and infrastructure, is creating markets for them, dealing with the contentious issues in value capture, for instance, or in property taxation, for that matter, or in land use conservation, or even in climate change. And how do you actually bring these issues, the contentious issues, and you sort of disarm some of the cliches or some of the misunderstandings there is there. This is really what we should care about. And there are a number of topics that we really need to focus extensively. One of them that we have been groping with and have been struggling with is, how do you fund climate change? The forms of mitigation or adaptation with land. How do you work out this connection of land values, climate change, and funding? And the understanding, it's impossible to think, as going back to another argument, it's impossible to think about land policy if you don't understand land markets. And how do you do that? We need to actually work seriously about how to communicate, how to train people, educate people on the understanding of land market. This is underneath property tax, is underneath land uses, land conservation, is underneath. This is the base for everything. But I'll leave it there.
These issues are persevering. Before I move on to Daphne, I just want you to take stock on the issue of slums and informal settlement. Just very briefly, I know it's a big subject, but do you see that pattern continuing, to happen no matter what we do? Or what's your sort of big picture assessment on informal settlement?
This is this in some places the people are beginning to get the understanding that slums and all that, this is not a consequence of poverty. It's something that produces poverty. And the origin of slums and informal settlements has to do with dysfunctional urban land markets. And this is something that we're sort of inverting that equation. This is something that I learned over the years of doing this work in Latin America, that perhaps the synthesis of that is the structural incapacity of land markets to produce a sufficient supply of service land at affordable prices. How do you do that? And it's an important fundamental structural idea that we need to pass on. And I don't think before we actually address heavily on the understanding of improving the functioning of land markets, we would ever have any chance of dealing with informality in slums and all that. That's my
Daphne?
That's my line.
Daphne, big challenges going forward.
So in the U.S., I think one of the most daunting challenges is the widespread disrespect for and lack of trust in government. And you might think, well, why am I focused on the property tax? Well, we have federal government, state government, and local government. By focusing on the property tax, you're focusing on the fuel that helps make local government work. And local government in the United States is not trivial. There are 90,000 local governments in the U.S., and the property tax accounts for almost $600 billion. So, when I worry from day to day about our issues with government writ large in the United States, I feel like, okay, I'm helping on some part of government by helping local government. But I agree with Martim that communication is just so critical. And if there was some way to get people to pay less attention to the sensational, which is often erroneous, some kind of myth, some misunderstanding, and have them pay more attention to things that are sensible. How do you do that? That may be intractable, but I remember when I was much younger watching the news, thinking about one news show where they had the courage to be boring, and could we get people's attention to pay more attention to factual, sensible, true things, and then that would help solve the government problem.
Well, there's nothing like a property tax bill to get people riled up, right? Armando, you'll have the last word.
All right. Well, Martim's already mentioned the challenge of climate change as one of our future jobs to do at the Lincoln Institute. Obviously, not a solved problem at all. One aspect that I'll talk about goes back to our work with Regional Plan Association after Hurricane Sandy, which had a devastating impact on the New York metropolitan area. And we did a couple of policy focus reports with them about the lessons that had been learned from the recovery efforts after Sandy, which were, notably successful in many ways, but also the issue of retreat from areas that are made uninhabitable by climate change. And this is a global issue. It's not just a New York issue or a U.S. issue by any means, and some of the poorest people in the world are most affected by it. So it also relates to our concerns about inequality and the ways in which vulnerable populations are being affected by climate change. But it's turned out to be a very difficult topic. Managed retreat is just not, it's even less popular probably than taxes. And it is very hard to do. We saw some successful examples in the aftermath of Sandy. There are a few cases around the country where people have been able to do what they have to do to step back from the hazards presented by climate change, but mostly they don't. Mostly they just go back. And obviously, as I mentioned, this affects vulnerable populations, poor people more than others, and that has to be central in the way we think about it. But I would say without question, moving back from some of the more hazardous zones, whether they be wildfires or flooding or other areas where property and people will be lost, has to happen. And it's going to take continued work by the Institute within its own areas of expertise to help make that happen. I'm pleased that we haven't given up on this. This is one of the longstanding areas of work. We work with the Climate Migration Network, to mention one of our other methods of doing our land policy work. We've learned some lessons through them in terms of not so much coming to communities with expertise, but working inside those communities with local leaders and experts, and really understanding that they have to make decisions and they need to be well informed in order to do that. But in many ways, they have to inform themselves, and we can only help. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one area, but I think it's hugely important. The Institute continues to work on it, and it's essential that we do that.
And it's so fraught that it's really an exercise in being sensitive to the populations that are at issue. So you're saying not coming in and saying, well, this is how we're going to manage your retreat and here's how it's going to happen, but equipping people to make some of their own decisions. That's a pretty heady role for a nonprofit organization, isn't it?
But one of the early lessons for me dealing with climate change as a planner is the ways in which this isn't an engineering problem, not simply a matter of saying how much climate change do we need to prepare for, and how high do the buildings have to be. It's much more complicated than that, and partly because of the uncertainty, partly because of the ways in which the impacts play out. A lot to do with human behavior, a lot to do with vested interests, culture, politics, weird politics.
Tragedy of the commons also, right?
Many tragedies here, and I'd say it really tests the ability of planners and those who are in the municipal management and so forth. Really tests their ability to work with people to do very difficult things. Mm-hmm. But the consequences of not doing those difficult things are unimaginably horrible, and not anything we can accept. So we've got to do it, but it has not turned out to be easy at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, not being easy has certainly not been an obstacle for any of you. So thank you for sharing all of these experiences. Well, this has been an extraordinary three-way conversation, and I know one for the archives here at the Lincoln Institute, as we all continue to learn from all of you. Daphne Kenyon, Armando Carbonell, Martim Smolka, thank you for joining this special edition of Land Matters. Climate change, urban planning, the property tax, financing infrastructure, addressing slums in the developing world, you can find it all at the Lincoln Institute website. Just go to lincolninst.edu and follow us on Twitter. The handle is @landpolicy. The Land Matters podcast is dedicated to bringing you all kinds of content related to land use and planning and how cities work. So please rate, share, and subscribe so you never miss a show. This has been so wonderful. Again, thank you to our guests. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Until next time, thanks for joining us.